The year is 1457. High in the Albanian mountains, before the first light of dawn, 8,000 men wait in silence. Below them, in a narrow valley wrapped in mist, an Ottoman army sleeps. Fires burn low, horses shift in their tethers, armor rests beside bedrolls. By sunrise, everything will change. But to understand how this moment became possible, we have to step back. 4 years earlier, in 1453, Constantinople fell. The ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire, what many in Europe still called the Second Rome, collapsed under the cannons of Sultan Mehmed II. He was only 21 years old, young, brilliant, relentless. When he rode through the shattered gates, the balance of power in Europe shifted overnight. Across the continent, church bells rang in fear rather than celebration. In Venice, in Rome, in Vienna, rulers who had argued for decades suddenly understood something very simple. The Ottoman Empire was no longer advancing slowly, it was accelerating. Serbia had fallen. Bosnia trembled. Hungary was under constant pressure. The Eastern Mediterranean was effectively Ottoman water. To many observers at the time, the expansion looked unstoppable. And yet, in the mountains of Albania, one man refused to bow. His name was George Castrioti. The Ottomans called him Skanderbeg, Skanderbeg. Today, history remembers him as the Dragon of Albania. What makes his story so extraordinary is this: he had once been one of them. As a boy, he was taken to the Ottoman court as a political hostage. This was common practice. Sons of Balkan nobles were raised in the Sultan's household, educated in Ottoman ways, trained as soldiers and administrators. Many rose to prominence within the empire. Skanderbeg did more than rise, he excelled. He fought in Ottoman campaigns across the Balkans and Anatolia. He earned respect. He commanded troops. He understood Ottoman strategy from the inside, how they marched, how they camped, how they organized their forces. And then, in 1443, during a campaign in the Balkans, he made a decision that would define his life. He broke away from the Ottoman army. With a small group of loyal Albanian cavalry, he rode to the fortress of Kruja. Through a combination of forged documents and bold timing, he seized it in the Sultan's name, then declared it for himself. He renounced Islam. He publicly returned to Christianity. He raised the black double-headed eagle of his family over the walls, and he called the Albanian clans to unite. Now, Albania at that time was not a unified kingdom. It was a patchwork of rival nobles and mountain strongholds. Clans fought each other as often as they fought outsiders. Unity was fragile. But Skanderbeg managed to create something new, a league of Albanian lords bound together for common defense. For 14 years, they resisted. The Ottomans sent expedition after expedition into those mountains. Each time they expected to crush a small rebellion. Each time they were drawn into narrow passes, ambushed on steep slopes, harassed in forests where cavalry could not maneuver freely. Skanderbeg understood numbers. He understood that he could not match the Sultan soldier for soldier, so he chose the terrain as his ally. And terrain in Albania is unforgiving. Ridges rise sharply, valleys narrow suddenly, paths twist along cliffs where a single misstep can mean death. An army that does not know the land is at a constant disadvantage. By 1457, Sultan Mehmed had grown impatient. The conqueror of Constantinople could not allow a mountain prince to mock imperial authority year after year. A large army was assembled, tens of thousands of men. Contemporary sources sometimes say 80,000. Modern historians debate the exact figure, suggesting it may have been closer to 40 or 50,000. Either way, the imbalance was overwhelming. Skanderbeg could likely muster 8 to 10,000 men at most. Even at the most conservative estimate, the Ottomans outnumbered him several times over. But this campaign carried something even more dangerous than numbers. Among the Ottoman commanders was Hamza Castrioti, Skanderbeg's own nephew. Hamza had chosen a different path. He remained loyal to the Sultan. He served within the Ottoman structure, and he knew the Albanian mountains. He knew his uncle's habits. He understood how Skanderbeg preferred to fight. Family loyalty ran deep in the Balkans. To fight against your own blood was not a small matter. Historians still debate Hamza's motives: ambition, survival, genuine loyalty to the empire. We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that his presence gave the Ottomans confidence. They marched into Albania expecting resistance at fortified towns. They expected sieges. They expected Skanderbeg to retreat to the highlands and wait. Instead, something unusual happened. The Albanian army seemed to disappear. Villages were empty, watchtowers abandoned, no skirmishes, no harassment, no arrows from tree lines. For an Ottoman commander, that silence could be interpreted in two ways. Either the enemy had fled, or he was preparing something. The Ottoman army eventually entered a valley known as Ujëbardha, called Albulena in some Latin sources. It appeared ideal for encampment. There was space for thousands of tents, access to water, slopes on three sides that looked protective rather than threatening. They set up camp. From above, hidden in forests and behind rock outcrops, Albanian eyes watched. Skanderbeg had divided his force into separate groups, placing them carefully along the heights. They moved mostly at night, using paths invisible to outsiders. They lit no fires. They made no noise that would carry down the slopes. By the time the Ottomans settled in for the night, they were surrounded, though they did not yet know it. At dawn, the trap would close. When Skanderbeg's war horn sounded, it echoed through the valley like a signal from the mountains themselves. Arrows fell from multiple directions, not a scattered attack, but coordinated volleys from above. The Ottoman camp, tightly packed with tents, ropes, and equipment, became a maze of confusion. Soldiers scrambled for shields and weapons. Officers shouted commands that were swallowed by echoes. Then came the next phase. Albanian infantry descended through ravines and forested slopes. Cavalry struck from the flank where the valley narrowed against a rock wall. The very ground that had seemed safe the night before now worked against the Ottoman formations. Numbers in such terrain can become a liability. Too many men in too little space. Lines cannot form properly. Units collide with one another. Visibility drops as dust and smoke rise. Skanderbeg understood this. He had studied Ottoman methods for years. He knew that discipline could restore order if given time. So, he did not give them time. Fires were set along the slopes. Smoke rolled down into the valley, thick and blinding. In that haze, even experienced soldiers struggled to distinguish friend from foe. Accounts from the period describe chaos so intense that units lost cohesion entirely. Orders were misunderstood. Groups became isolated. Attempts to rally collapsed under renewed assaults from the heights. Casualty figures vary widely in the sources. Some chroniclers claim 30,000 Ottoman dead. Others give lower estimates. Medieval numbers are often inflated, especially when describing enemy losses. But even modern historians agree that the defeat was catastrophic. An entire Ottoman field army was shattered. Thousands were killed. In the medieval Balkans, family wasn't just personal. It was political. It was protection. It was survival. Your name connected you to land, to allies, to obligations that could outlast any treaty. That's why the name Castrioti matters so much in the summer of 1457. I'm Steve Turcotte, and if you stay with me through this part of the story, I think you'll feel the weight of something that doesn't show up in casualty lists or campaign maps. Betrayal inside a family doesn't just change a battle, it changes how people see the entire world around them. Skanderbeg had held Albania together for years through a mixture of force, charisma, and necessity. The League of Leisure was never a perfect union. The Albanian clans had long memories, sharp pride, and plenty of old grudges. But they had one shared reality. If they fought separately, they would be absorbed separately. And for more than a decade, Skanderbeg made them believe unity was possible. Now the Ottomans were coming again. this time with a force so large that even the generous estimates leave no doubt about the imbalance. Some medieval sources speak of 80,000. Modern historians often argue the true number was smaller, perhaps closer to 40 or 50,000. Either way, the message was the same. The empire wasn't sending a raid, it was sending an eraser. The Ottoman commander most commonly named in the accounts is Ishak Bey, a veteran governor and soldier. He had faced resistance before. He knew what it was to campaign in difficult country. But experience can cut two ways. It can make you cautious, or it can convince you that you've already seen everything. This time, Ishak Bey also had a guide who seemed impossible to beat. Hamza Kastrioti, Skanderbeg's nephew. I want you to picture how that would land among the Albanians. A nephew isn't a distant relative in a clan culture. He's part of the inner circle. He's the kind of man who knows the private paths, the water sources, the places where you can hide 1,000 fighters and leave no sign. He knows which valleys swallow sound and which ridges can be crossed at night without breaking your neck. Hamza had chosen Ottoman service. He had embraced the empire's rewards and, according to the sources, converted as well. But we have to be careful with the motives here. Medieval chroniclers loved simple moral categories: hero, traitor, saint, villain. Real people aren't so tidy. Maybe Hamza believed the empire would win eventually and he wanted to be on the winning side. Maybe he resented living under his uncle's shadow. Maybe he thought Skanderbeg's rebellion was doomed and wanted to spare himself the inevitable collapse. Or maybe he was caught in the kind of pressure that squeezes choice out of a man until loyalty becomes whatever keeps you alive. Whatever his reasons, the Ottomans saw him as a key, not just to Albania's roads, but to Skanderbeg's mind. And that confidence shaped everything that followed. As the Ottoman army marched into Albanian territory, they expected the usual pattern. Some skirmishing, raids on the column's edges, harassment of supply lines, then a retreat into fortresses. They expected to grind forward slowly, laying siege where needed, and forcing surrender by exhaustion. Instead, they found something unnerving. Nothing. Villages that should have been noisy with alarm were absent. Lookouts that should have signaled from ridges were absent. Scouts rode ahead and came back with the same report, again and again. No enemy in sight. No ambush. No smoke from cooking fires on the hills. It felt like the land had emptied itself. In a conventional war, that might sound like good news, but in mountain warfare, silence can be a warning. It means the enemy isn't gone. It means the enemy is watching. Hamza, according to the narrative tradition, reassured Ishak Bey. He suggested his uncle was falling back, gathering his clans, preparing to cling to the strongest fortresses. It sounded plausible because it matched what Skanderbeg had done before. But here's the part that matters. Skanderbeg didn't retreat, he relocated. His fighters moved like a shadow that breaks apart and reforms. Small groups, night marches, no fires, no loud movements. Paths that horses struggle to follow, caves and forest hollows during the day. A discipline that's hard to maintain because it means hunger, cold, and constant strain. This wasn't only strategy, it was a test of will. And it was also something else. A deliberate story that Skanderbeg was telling the Ottomans. The story was, I'm not here. You're safe. Keep walking. It's easy to underestimate how powerful that kind of deception can be. When an army moves through enemy territory and meets no resistance, it starts to feel protected by its own size. The men relax. The officers trust routine. The scouts stop expecting surprises. Security becomes a habit instead of an action. Then, when the trap springs, the shock is not just physical, it's psychological. The brain can't keep up. Somewhere ahead lay the place Skanderbeg had chosen to concentrate that shock. The valley, known in the sources as Ujëbardha, often called Albulena in Latin tradition. The exact geography is debated, but the tactical features described are consistent. A valley floor wide enough to tempt a camp, slopes steep enough to control the space, forests and rock to hide men above, and most importantly, a limited route in and out. perfect for an army that thinks it's resting, disastrous for an army that suddenly needs to maneuver. As the Ottoman vanguard approached, the valley must have looked like a gift: flat ground, water, space, a place to recover before pressing deeper into the mountains. Ishak Bey made the call to camp. And while the Ottoman tents went up below, Skanderbeg's men closed into their final positions above, tightening the ring without being seen. That's where part 2 ends, and I want you to sit with that image for a moment. An empire's army settles into a valley, believing it has time. The defenders, outnumbered many times, crouch in silence on the heights, betting everything on surprise and terrain. In war, numbers matter, but sometimes the ground matters more. And sometimes the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't a sword or a bow, it's certainty. Picture a valley that looks harmless when you first see it. A wide floor of grass and trampled earth, surrounded by steep slopes that rise into dark forest. The air up here is thin, sound carries strangely, and in the right weather, especially in early September, mist settles into the low ground and refuses to leave. The sources call this place Ujëbardha. In Latin accounts, you'll often see Albulena. Historians still debate the exact spot on the modern map, but the descriptions agree on the kind of terrain that matters: a valley that can hold a large camp, with wooded heights that can hide men, and only limited ways in or out for an army that suddenly needs room to move. If you've ever wondered how ambushes become disasters, it often starts with a place like this. Not dramatic at first glance, just convenient, and convenience can be deadly. By the evening of September 1st, 1457, the Ottoman army entered the valley and began doing what any army would do after a hard march. They made camp. I want you to imagine the scene from ground level: tents rising in rows, ropes staked into the soil, cooking fires spreading into clusters of orange light, horses picketed and watered, men setting down packs with that familiar relief that comes when the day's marching is over. You can almost hear it: the small clatter of metal, the low murmur of conversation, the scrape of wood against stone as tools are put away. From the Ottoman perspective, this was a reasonable decision. The valley offered space, water, and a sense of protection. On 3 sides, the slopes were steep. If an enemy attacked from above, the Ottomans assumed they would see it coming. And if the Albanian army truly had withdrawn, as the lack of resistance suggested, then this was simply a pause before the final push. But from Skanderbeg's perspective, it was something else entirely. It was a lid being placed on a pot. What makes this moment so unsettling is that the killing hadn't started yet, and it still required enormous discipline. Skanderbeg's men were already in the mountains around the valley. They had been moving in small groups, mostly at night, and hiding through the day. They had avoided fires. They had wrapped metal so it wouldn't glint or clink. They had chosen paths that outsiders wouldn't dare use in darkness. None of that is romantic. It's miserable. It's cold, hungry work. And it's the kind of work that breaks armies long before the enemy ever arrives. Yet they held. Skanderbeg divided his force into separate groups, placing them around the valley in positions that could strike at once. The details differ depending on the chronicler, but the shape of the plan is clear. The Albanians needed height, concealment, and control of the approaches. They needed to make the enemy feel safe right up until the moment safety vanished. And then there's the part that should make you pause, because it foreshadows what's coming. Skanderbeg's men prepared bundles of dry wood and brush in hidden places along the slopes, not to burn the enemy directly, not as some medieval spectacle, but to create smoke, thick, choking smoke, at a moment when the Ottomans would most need sight and coordination. If you want to understand Skanderbeg as a commander, this is it. He wasn't just thinking in terms of blades and arrows. He was thinking about breadth, visibility, fear, and confusion. He was thinking about how an army behaves when it can't understand what's happening. That night, as the Ottoman camp settled, sentries took their posts in the routine way soldiers do when they've marched without incident for days. The perimeter was guarded, but not with the kind of nervous intensity you see in a force that expects trouble. One side of the camp, the side that looked weakest in the accounts, lay closer to forest and gentler slopes. Ravines ran down from above like hidden corridors. The Ottomans knew those ravines existed. What they believed, encouraged by their own confidence and perhaps by the reassurance of Hamza Kastrioti, was that no significant force could use those paths in darkness without being detected. Up on those slopes, Albanian men were already lying in place. As full darkness arrived, the final movements began. I want you to imagine how careful this had to be. A single loose stone could tumble downhill and strike a tent stake. A single cough could carry in the night air. A sword brushing a rock could sound like a bell if the world is quiet enough. They moved anyway. Some crawled, some slid down short drops, some followed narrow ridgelines where one misstep meant a broken leg or worse. They used hand signals. They avoided speaking. They kept the shapes of their bodies low against the earth, not because it looked dramatic, but because it works. By around 3 in the morning, they were in their final positions. And then came the hardest part, waiting. That waiting is always overlooked, but it's where plans fail. Men shift their weight, they get cramps, they lose focus, they get scared, and fear makes people do foolish things. Yet the sources suggest the Albanians held their discipline. Dawn on September 2nd arrived slowly. Mist clung to the valley floor. The Ottoman camp began to stir, not with panic, but with that sluggish rhythm of men who expect an ordinary day. Breakfast fires came back to life. Morning prayers began. Horses were fed. Officers began thinking about the next march. From above, the Albanian positions remained invisible. And this is where I want you to feel the moral tension of the moment, not just the tactical one. Because an ambush like this is not an even fight between equals. It's not a clean contest. It's an intentional collapse of the enemy's ability to understand reality. War does that. It turns intelligence and preparation into a kind of weapon that doesn't feel like a weapon until it's too late. Somewhere in that mist, down on the valley floor, thousands of Ottoman soldiers were standing up, stretching sore legs, lifting cups, tightening straps, still believing they had control of the day. They didn't know that death was already arranged around them, waiting for a single signal. And if you could freeze time right there, before the horn, before the arrows, you'd see what this battle really was. Not an even fight, a trap, closing. It's just after dawn on September 2nd, 1457. The mist is still sitting in the valley like a heavy blanket, and down on the valley floor the Ottoman camp is waking the way camps always wake. Men stretch sore backs, horses snort and stamp. A few small breakfast fires come back to life. Nothing about it feels like the opening of a catastrophe. Up on the slopes, though, Skanderbeg is already in position. This is the moment where planning becomes irreversible. If he waits too long, the Ottomans march out. If he strikes too early, he risks losing surprise. And if he misjudges the rhythm of the camp by even a few minutes, the whole thing can unravel. Then the signal comes. A war horn sounds from the high ground, and the note doesn't just travel forward, it bounces, it ricochets off the valley walls and seems to come from everywhere at once. That matters, because in a tight valley you don't just hear a warning, you hear confusion. In the camp below, heads snap up. A few soldiers freeze mid-step, half awake and suddenly alert. Officers start to shout, trying to pull people into formation. Men reach for shields and helmets that aren't where they should be, because camps are never neat when an army thinks it's safe. And in those first seconds, those first heartbeats, the Ottomans are still trying to understand what kind of threat this is. They don't get the time. Arrows begin to fall. Not in a single stream, not from one ridgeline, but from multiple angles. Albanian archers placed during the night on the heights release their first volleys into the dense camp. The Ottoman army's greatest strength, its size, becomes a vulnerability. Tents, rope lines, supply piles, horses, men packed close together. It's the worst possible environment for a force that suddenly needs to spread out and think. You can imagine the sound of it, shafts hitting canvas, shields, earth, wood, the dull thud of impact, the sharper crack when an arrow punches into a tent pole, the sudden animal screams as horses react to pain and panic. A camp that was quiet and routine becomes loud in a way that's hard to command. And then the shouting begins on the slopes. The Albanian battle cries don't come from one direction either. They erupt in different places, overlapping, echoing, multiplying in the valley's acoustics. Even veteran troops can struggle when they can't locate the enemy by sound. You point your shield one way, and the next heartbeat the threat feels like it's behind you. That is the psychological core of this ambush. It's not just violence, it's disorientation. Ottoman officers do what they're trained to do. They try to anchor the camp. They try to form lines. They try to pull the best disciplined troops into something stable, something that can absorb shock. The Ottomans have units that are meant for exactly this kind of crisis. Even in chaos, parts of the force start to stiffen. A few groups begin to gather shields and level spears, trying to create islands of order. But Skanderbeg's plan isn't a single strike, it's pressure from several directions at once. As arrow fire continues, Albanian infantry begin pouring down from hidden ravines and forested slopes. These aren't glamorous charges across open fields, they're controlled descents through steep terrain, men picking their way quickly but carefully, using gravity and familiarity with the ground to arrive at the camp's edge in a rush. Now the Ottomans aren't just being shot from above, they're being hit on the ground, between their own tents, where ropes and stakes turn every lane into an obstacle course. And then the cavalry arrives. Skanderbeg leads one of the key mounted strikes himself, pushing into the Ottoman left side where the valley wall creates a natural funnel. It's an important detail. In open country, cavalry can maneuver and adjust. In a cramped valley pressed against rock, cavalry becomes a battering ram. The Albanians drive into men who are still trying to find their places, still lifting shields, still stepping over ropes, still turning their heads to chase sounds. The collision is brutal, and it's made worse by the environment. Soldiers can't step back without tripping. They can't spread out without running into their own tent lines. Horses can't veer freely because the space is crowded. Everything compresses. And then another Albanian force strikes from a different direction, and the Ottomans begin to lose the one thing an army cannot lose and remain an army: coordination. In the middle of this, Hamza Castrioti is there, Skanderbeg's nephew, serving the invaders. You can picture him in the command zone, trying to read the chaos, trying to make his advice matter. Whatever he believed about his uncle's habits, this doesn't look like a simple raid and retreat. This looks like an attempt to break the invasion outright. Ishak Bey, the Ottoman commander, tries to impose order. He's experienced, and he's not the kind of man who panics in the first minute of a fight. He works to rally a corps. He tries to establish a point that other units can move towards. And for brief moments it seems possible that Ottoman discipline might hold, at least long enough to stabilize. But Skanderbeg's plan isn't a single strike, it's pressure from several directions at once. As arrow fire continues, Albanian infantry begin pouring down from hidden ravines and forested slopes. These aren't glamorous charges across open fields, they're controlled descents through steep terrain, men picking their way quickly but carefully, using gravity and familiarity with the ground to arrive at the camp's edge in a rush. Now the Ottomans aren't just being shot from above, they're being hit on the ground, between their own tents, where ropes and stakes turn every lane into an obstacle course. And then the cavalry arrives. Skanderbeg leads one of the key mounted strikes himself, pushing into the Ottoman left side where the valley wall creates a natural funnel. It's an important detail. In open country, cavalry can maneuver and adjust. In a cramped valley pressed against rock, cavalry becomes a battering ram. The Albanians drive into men who are still trying to find their places, still lifting shields, still stepping over ropes, still turning their heads to chase sounds. The collision is brutal, and it's made worse by the environment. Soldiers can't step back without tripping. They can't spread out without running into their own tent lines. Horses can't veer freely because the space is crowded. Everything compresses. And then another Albanian force strikes from a different direction, and the Ottomans begin to lose the one thing an army cannot lose and remain an army: coordination. In the middle of this, Hamza Castrioti is there, Skanderbeg's nephew, serving the invaders. You can picture him in the command zone, trying to read the chaos, trying to make his advice matter. Whatever he believed about his uncle's habits, this doesn't look like a simple raid and retreat. This looks like an attempt to break the invasion outright.
Ishak Bey, the Ottoman commander, tries to impose order. He's experienced, and he's not the kind of man who panics in the first minute of a fight. He works to rally a corps. He tries to establish a point that other units can move towards. And for brief moments it seems possible that Ottoman discipline might hold, at least long enough to stabilize. But Skanderbeg's plan isn't a single strike. It's pressure from several directions at once. As arrow fire continues, Albanian infantry begin pouring down from hidden ravines and forested slopes. These aren't glamorous charges across open fields. They're controlled descents through steep terrain, men picking their way quickly but carefully, using gravity and familiarity with the ground to arrive at the camp's edge in a rush. Now the Ottomans aren't just being shot from above, they're being hit on the ground, between their own tents, where ropes and stakes turn every lane into an obstacle course. And then the cavalry arrives. Skanderbeg leads one of the key mounted strikes himself, pushing into the Ottoman left side where the valley wall creates a natural funnel. It's an important detail. In open country, cavalry can maneuver and adjust. In a cramped valley pressed against rock, cavalry becomes a battering ram. The Albanians drive into men who are still trying to find their places, still lifting shields, still stepping over ropes, still turning their heads to chase sounds. The collision is brutal, and it's made worse by the environment. Soldiers can't step back without tripping. They can't spread out without running into their own tent lines. Horses can't veer freely because the space is crowded. Everything compresses.
Before we go any further into the smoke and the killing, I want to slow the story down for a moment and talk about something that historians wrestle with every time this battle is mentioned: the numbers. The casualty figures reported for Albulena are extraordinary. Some sources claim the Ottomans lost as many as 30,000 dead in a single morning. Others give lower totals. Modern historians are cautious because medieval chroniclers often exaggerated, sometimes out of pride, sometimes out of fear, and sometimes simply because nobody in that chaos could count with precision. So when you hear big totals, don't think of them as a neat ledger. Think of them as a way people tried to describe scale. Whether the dead numbered in the tens of thousands or only many thousands, what matters is that a huge Ottoman force was shattered so completely that its campaign collapsed on the spot. Now, back in the valley, the first shock of the ambush is giving way to something worse. The Ottomans are not amateurs. Parts of the army tried to do what disciplined troops are trained to do when everything falls apart. Units begin to form defensive blocks. The Janissaries, elite infantry, start building their squares, shields and spear points, creating hard edges in a sea of confusion. Ishak Bey, the Ottoman commander named in many accounts, tries to rally men around him. You can picture the scene. Officers shouting until their voices crack, runners weaving through tent ropes, soldiers pushing toward any place that looks like order. For brief moments, it almost works. But this battlefield is not open ground. It's a camp, built for rest, not for survival. Every tent rope is a trip line. Every stake is an obstacle. Every narrow lane becomes a funnel. The more men try to move at once, the more they choke their own movement. And above all of it, arrows keep falling from the slopes. Then Skanderbeg makes the decision that transforms a brutal ambush into a full collapse. He uses fire, not as a dramatic spectacle, not as some medieval horror story, but as a tool to take away the Ottomans' eyesight. On his signal, Albanian fighters ignite bundles of brush and dry wood they prepared in advance along the valley sides. Flames catch quickly. Smoke starts thin, then thickens, and then it becomes a moving wall. The mountain wind does the rest, pushing those clouds down into the valley floor, rolling them through the tents and over the men like a tide. Imagine what it's like to fight with your throat burning, your eyes watering, and visibility shrinking to a few steps. You can't see banners, you can't see formations, you can't even read the battlefield. You can't even be sure the man in front of you is an enemy. This is where the battle turns nightmarish, and where psychology becomes as deadly as steel. In the smoke, friendly fire becomes inevitable. Ottoman soldiers catch glimpses of movement and strike at shadows.
Arrows are loosed at shapes that vanish. Blades swing at figures that stumble too close. In some accounts, men shout that they're Ottoman, trying to stop their comrades from killing them. But in a choking cloud, with screams and echoes bouncing off the valley walls, certainty dies fast. Meanwhile, the Albanians have a different experience. They're not immune to confusion, but they're positioned to take advantage of it. They know the slopes, they know the ravines, they've rehearsed where to move and when. And crucially, many of them are operating from higher ground, above the worst of the smoke, looking down into a camp that's becoming blind. I always come back to how cold this is as a method. Brilliant, yes. Effective, absolutely. But cold. It isn't about heroics, it's about control. Control of space, control of breath, control of fear. And then, somewhere in the middle of this chaos, Isak Bey falls. The sources don't agree on exactly how. Some say he was struck down in the fighting, others suggest he was caught in the panic, trampled, overwhelmed, swallowed by the very crowd he was trying to command. In a choking cloud with screams and echoes bouncing off the valley walls, certainty dies fast. Now, the Ottoman force begins to behave less like an army and more like a mass of individuals trying to escape. Men drift toward the valley mouth because it's the only open direction their instincts recognize. Units dissolve, officers become isolated. The Janissary squares that held for a time become islands, then shrinking islands, then fragments. And through it all, Skanderbeg's pressure doesn't let up. At this stage, we should be careful with dramatic claims of exact killing rates or minute-by-minute death tolls. Medieval warfare was messy, and chroniclers loved numbers that sounded impossible. But we can say with confidence that the concentration of violence was extreme. A packed camp, attacked from height, struck from multiple directions, blinded by smoke, and choked by its own congestion. This is a recipe for catastrophic losses. By late morning, the battle is no longer a contest, it's a collapse. When the smoke begins to thin in places, sunlight cuts through in harsh patches, revealing broken tents, scattered weapons, and bodies in the lanes. Survivors stumble through it, coughing, blinking, dazed. Some still try to fight, many are simply trying to breathe. And the Albanians keep moving forward, step by step, clearing the camp, taking control of space that the Ottomans can no longer organize. That is what makes Part 5 so important. The turning point isn't a single heroic duel, it's a tactical innovation that attacks the enemy's ability to function. Skanderbeg doesn't just defeat men, he defeats their coordination, their confidence, and their senses. By the time noon approaches, the Ottoman invasion is finished as a coherent force. Whatever the final tally, whether the dead number in the many thousands or into the tens of thousands, the strategic result is the same. The valley has done its work, and Skanderbeg has done his.
By midday, the valley no longer sounds like a battle, it sounds like aftermath. The worst of the smoke is thinning. Sunlight comes down in hard, bright patches, and it lands on a scene that feels almost impossible to absorb. Tents torn open, wagons overturned, shields scattered in the mud, and men moving through it like they've woken up inside a nightmare. This is the moment when the story narrows from armies to people. Somewhere beyond the shattered camp, small groups of Ottoman survivors try to slip away into the folds of the mountains. They move the way frightened men move when they no longer trust banners or commands, keeping low, taking ravines and tree lines, looking for any path that isn't watched. But this is Albania, and on these paths, the Albanians are not strangers. Albanian cavalry and small hunting parties begin pushing out of the valley, not in a wild chase, but in a methodical sweep. They know where a man will go when he's desperate. They know which gullies dead end, which creeks can be followed, which ridges feel safe until they're not. Escape in a place like this is never just about speed, it's about knowledge. And that's when Hamza Kastriotti's story catches up with him. The sources agree on the broad outcome. Skanderbeg's nephew is captured. The details are less clear. Some accounts suggest he's taken while trying to rally a small group.
Others imply he's simply cut off while withdrawing, caught by men who know the terrain as well as he does. Either way, the image is stark. A man who rode into these mountains with the empire at his back is suddenly standing under guard, dust on his face, his hands bound, the noise of the valley behind him fading into a distant roar. There's a temptation, especially in later retellings, to turn this into a theatrical scene, a villain dragged before a hero, a perfect speech, a clean moral verdict. History rarely gives us that kind of clarity. What it does give us is the fact that Hamza is brought before Skanderbeg, and Skanderbeg does not execute him on the spot. In a world where betrayal could be repaid in blood without much debate, that choice matters. I want you to sit with it for a second. Skanderbeg has every practical reason to kill the man. Hamza has guided an invading army. He has likely cost Albanian lives. He has broken family bonds in a culture where those bonds are supposed to be unbreakable. And yet, Skanderbeg chooses imprisonment. Maybe it's calculation. A live-in captive can be traded, ransomed, used as leverage. Maybe it's propaganda, proof to other wavering Albanians that returning home might still be possible. Maybe it's simply that killing your own blood, even in war, leaves a stain that no victory washes away. Or maybe it's all of these things at once. Human motives tend to overlap, especially under pressure. The sources suggest Hamza is ultimately sent to Naples and held there for years. That too reads like a political decision, keeping him alive but far away from Ottoman hands and far away from Albanian factional chaos. While that personal drama unfolds, another decision is taking shape across the valley. At first, in the fury of the ambush, many Ottoman soldiers who tried to surrender were cut down anyway. That isn't pretty, and it isn't heroic, but it is common in battles where the attackers are outnumbered and terrified of being overwhelmed if they hesitate. In the first hours, mercy can feel like suicide. But as the Ottoman force breaks completely, the logic changes. Skanderbeg's men begin to realize something. They can't kill everyone. Not fast enough, not cleanly, not without losing control of their own victory. And the value of prisoners becomes obvious. A captive can be exchanged. A captive can carry stories home. A captive can be turned into money, supplies, influence. So Skanderbeg issues an order. Take them alive. That order doesn't instantly change the emotional temperature of the battlefield. Some men are too deep in adrenaline. Some have seen too much. Some are acting on grief that has nowhere to go. But gradually the shift happens. Albanian officers step between prisoners and blades. Guards begin tying wrists. Captives are herded into makeshift pens built from wagons, ropes, and spear shafts. And then something remarkable begins. Ottoman soldiers, seeing that some of their comrades are being spared, start surrendering in larger numbers. They drop weapons slowly. They lift hands. They kneel. You can imagine what that looks like across the valley floor. Lines of exhausted men, dusty and stunned, sitting in rows under guard as the smoke drifts away. The sounds change too. Fewer clashes of metal, more coughing, more murmured prayers, more quiet weeping that no one wants to admit to. This is one of those moments that forces a moral question into the story without anyone asking for it. What is victory supposed to mean? Is it the total destruction of the enemy, or is it control? Control of the battlefield, control of prisoners, control of what happens next. Skanderbeg, whatever he was, understood what happens next matters as much as what happened in the first hour. As the afternoon fades, the Albanians begin counting captured standards and sorting equipment. Captured banners are stacked, weapons are gathered, scribes and officers mark tallies, guards organize prisoner lines, patrols keep sweeping the surrounding countryside for stragglers. And Hamza, Skanderbeg's nephew, sits apart in captivity, no longer a commander, no longer a guide, just a man caught between the choices he made and the consequences he can't outrun. By nightfall, the valley is quieter, but it isn't peaceful. Campfires burn again, this time under Albanian control. The ridges are watched, the prisoner pens are guarded. The mountains, which gave Skanderbeg his victory, now hold the survivors in their grip. The battle is over, but the war between empires, between families, between what people call honor and what they do to survive,
still has years to run.
If you step back from the noise of the battle itself and look at Albulena as a problem of warfare, you quickly run into a word that comes up again and again in the sources: impossible. I'm Steve Turcotte, and I understand why people reached for that word. The reported numbers are extreme. Some chronicles talk about an Ottoman army that could have been as large as 80,000. Other historians argue for something closer to 40 or 50,000. Either way, Skanderbeg's force was far smaller, likely somewhere around 8 to 10,000 under his direct command. And the losses? Many accounts claim the Ottomans suffered casualties in the tens of thousands, with a huge number taken prisoner. Even if we treat those totals cautiously, the core fact doesn't change. An invasion force entered the valley confident and organized, and within hours it was shattered so badly that the campaign collapsed. So how do you make sense of something like that without turning it into myth? You start with the ground. That valley, Ujëbardha, Albulena, whatever name you prefer, wasn't just scenery, it was a weapon. A large army needs space to breathe. It needs clear lines to form up. It needs room for cavalry to maneuver and for commanders to see what's happening. In a narrow valley with steep slopes and a limited way in and out, size becomes a problem. The very thing that usually wins battles, numbers, can turn into congestion, noise, and confusion. Then you add surprise. The Albanians didn't just ambush the Ottomans, they convinced them there was nothing to ambush them. Days of silence, empty villages, no skirmishing, no visible resistance. An army that expects to be harassed and instead finds quiet starts to believe the quiet is safety. Scouts stop imagining danger behind every tree. Guards become routine. Officers begin thinking about the next objective, not the next threat. Surprise isn't only about attacking from concealment, it's about attacking when the enemy's mind has already decided nothing will happen. And once the signal came, Skanderbeg didn't give the Ottomans time to recover. That's another key point. Plenty of ambushes hurt an army and then fade away. This one kept tightening. Archers on the heights, pressure from multiple directions, attacks that kept the camp off balance. That brings us to psychology, which is where Albulena starts to feel modern. When soldiers can't see where the danger is coming from, when sound echoes and direction becomes unreliable, fear spreads faster than orders. In the valley, the Albanian battle cries didn't just raise morale, they distorted the Ottoman sense of scale. In an echoing bowl of stone and forest, 8,000 can sound like far more. And then, of course, there's the smoke. Fire wasn't used as a medieval spectacle, it was used as an instrument to steal visibility. You can train a man to hold a line under arrow fire. You can train him to keep formation under cavalry pressure. But take away sight, take away the ability to identify friend from foe, and even veteran troops can begin to fracture. The sources describe confusion so intense that Ottoman units struck at movement without knowing what it was. That's not a moral judgment, it's a human response to a battlefield that no longer makes sense. Local knowledge also mattered, in a way that's easy to underestimate if you're used to thinking in terms of armies, rather than land. Skanderbeg's men weren't just fighters, they were mountain people. They knew the paths that don't appear on maps. They knew how fog behaves in the morning. They knew where a ravine lets you move unseen and where it traps you. They could reposition at night and remain silent by day, because the habits of that landscape were already part of their lives. The Ottomans were operating in unfamiliar terrain, guided by Hamza Castrioti and others who knew the region. But knowing the routes isn't the same as owning the ground. Skanderbeg didn't need to predict every Ottoman move. He needed to shape the one move that mattered: camping in the wrong valley. Leadership is another piece we can't ignore. Skanderbeg was present and active, pushing attacks at the moments that mattered. Meanwhile, the Ottoman commander Isak Bey died during the battle. Exactly how is debated, but the effect is the same. In a crisis, a force can survive heavy losses, but it struggles to survive a sudden vacuum of command, especially inside a choking camp.
And finally, motivation. This part is always uncomfortable because it risks turning into propaganda, but it's still worth saying plainly. The Albanians were fighting for their homes. The Ottomans were fighting for an imperial objective. Both sides had brave men. Both sides had fear. But a defender who knows that defeat means occupation, tribute, and captivity often holds on in a way that's hard to measure. Put all of that together: terrain, surprise, pressure from multiple directions, smoke, echoing fear, and the collapse of command, and you start to see how a battle can become a disaster. Not magic, not destiny. A chain of decisions, executed with discipline, on ground that amplified every mistake. And that's why Albulena still gets studied. Not because it proves the weak always win. They don't. Albania would eventually fall after Skanderbeg's death. But because it shows something real about war. There are moments when numbers stop being the final argument, and the landscape, the mind, and the timing become decisive. In that valley, for a few hours in September, Skanderbeg didn't just defeat an army, he broke its ability to function. News doesn't travel fast in the 15th century, but it travels relentlessly. It moves on tired horses, along hard roads, from one guarded gate to the next. It moves in sealed letters, in breathless testimonies, in the frightened eyes of survivors who can't stop replaying what they saw. And after Albulena, that news moved like fire. I'm Steve Turcotte, and I want you to picture the first men who carried the story out of the mountains. Not triumphant envoys in clean armor, but shaken stragglers, men with smoke still in their hair, men who had been part of an army that expected to crush a rebellion and instead watched their camp turn into a trap. They reached Ottoman outposts across the Balkans with the same message, even if the details differed. The invasion had failed. Isak Bey was dead. Thousands were missing, killed, or captured. The road into Albania had not opened. It had slammed shut. In military terms, defeats happen. Empires lose battles. What makes this one different is the completeness of the collapse. The accounts, whether they exaggerate the exact totals or not, agree on the shape of the disaster. The Ottoman force didn't merely retreat, it broke. And when the reports finally made their way to Sultan Mehmed II, the reaction was not calm calculation. It was fury. Mehmed was not just any ruler. By this point, he had already taken Constantinople. He had already proven, to his own people and to his enemies, that he could do what other sultans and other kings could not. The conquest of that city wasn't only a military triumph, it was a statement about destiny, about legitimacy, about power that felt unstoppable. So when word arrived that a commander in the Albanian mountains had shattered a major expedition, it didn't just threaten a campaign, it threatened the story the empire told about itself. Later chroniclers describe Mehmed raging for days. Some even claim he executed messengers who brought confirmation of the defeat. That detail is debated, and it may be more literary than factual. Medieval writers loved to paint rulers as volcanic figures, rewarding good news and punishing bad as if reality itself could be disciplined. But even if we strip away the drama, the strategic consequence is clear. An expedition had been destroyed. Experienced soldiers were gone. Equipment was lost. Plans were disrupted. You don't replace that overnight, not even with imperial resources. And you can see the ripple effects almost immediately. Garrisons along the frontier become nervous. Patrols increase. Commanders become cautious about camping in enclosed ground. Routes that once seemed safe suddenly feel haunted. There's a psychological cost here that matters as much as the material one. When an army believes it's invincible, it moves differently. Officers take risks. Soldiers relax in enemy territory. Decisions become bold because the penalty for being wrong seems small. But when that belief is broken, when survivors start describing a valley that swallowed an army, behavior changes. Fear doesn't have to be rational to be effective. It only has to be shared. and this story was shared. Now, while the Ottomans absorbed the shock, something else was happening across Christian Europe. The same news moved westward too, carried by writers to Venice, to Rome, to Naples, to courts that had been watching the Ottoman advance with a mix of dread and resignation. To them, Skanderberg's victory meant more than a battlefield. It meant the Ottoman tide could be resisted. Not symbolically, not with prayers alone, with real force, in real terrain, at real cost to the empire. Churches rang bells, cities held services of thanksgiving. Princes and popes who had been reluctant to spend money on Balkan wars suddenly had a hero they could point to, a name that made sense of the fear, a figure that could be held up as a shield. Of course, that praise came with exaggeration. It always does. Poets don't write about uncertainty. They write about triumph. They turn hard, ugly warfare into clean images of salvation. But if you listen carefully, beneath the celebration, you can still hear the truth. Europe wasn't celebrating because war was glorious. Europe was celebrating because it had been terrified. Skanderbeg became, in Western imagination, proof that the Ottoman Empire could bleed. And it's worth asking, quietly, what that did to Skanderbeg himself, because being turned into a symbol is its own kind of burden. A man fighting to keep his country alive is suddenly expected to represent an entire continent's hope. In reality, Albania remained small, poor, and constantly exposed. Skanderbeg couldn't invade Anatolia. He couldn't threaten Constantinople. He could only do what he had always done: survive, resist, and make the conquest of his homeland expensive. Still, symbols matter. They change behavior. They open purses. They inspire alliances that might not otherwise exist. A victory like Albulena didn't end the Ottoman threat. It disrupted it. It bought time. It forced recalculation. And inside the Ottoman court, it forced something else: humility, even if it was swallowed rather than admitted. Mehmed II would continue to expand his empire. The Ottomans would continue to fight, and often to win. But after a disaster like this, the tone changes. You become more careful. You respect the ground you once dismissed. You stop assuming that numbers alone will solve a problem. That, to me, is the deeper consequence of Albulena. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't a myth, it was a demonstration that an empire, however powerful, can be made vulnerable by terrain, timing, and a commander who understands how fear moves through a camp faster than any messenger. And once that lesson is learned, by either side, it never really goes away.
When the smoke cleared over Albulena, it was tempting, especially for people far away, to treat the battle like a final answer. 8,000 men stood against an empire and won. The story almost writes itself. But history rarely ends when the cheering starts. I'm Steve Turcotte, and in this part of the journey, I want you to feel the long shadow that followed that September morning. Because what Skanderbeg achieved at Albulena wasn't a door that closed the war. It was a door that stayed open, just wide enough for Albania to keep breathing. In the days after the battle, the Albanian camp became something strange: part battlefield, part warehouse, part prison. Captured equipment was gathered and sorted. Standards were stacked. Weapons were repaired. Prisoners were counted, guarded, fed just enough to keep them alive. The valley that had been a trap became, for a time, a source of strength. An army that lived on thin margins suddenly had supplies it hadn't been able to afford. And then came the political work. Skanderbeg couldn't rely on victory alone. Albania was still surrounded by larger powers, and his League of Clans was still fragile. He needed money, recognition, and allies: Venice, Naples, the papacy, each with its own goals, each watching the Ottoman frontier like a storm front on the horizon. So letters went out. Seals were pressed into wax. Messengers rode hard over mountain roads and coastal routes.
In the halls of stone fortresses and in the chambers of city-states, the same question was asked again and again. Is this victory a turning point, or is it just a pause before the next wave? The answer, as always, was complicated. Because the Ottomans did not stop being the Ottomans, they absorbed defeats the way empires often do, by recruiting more men, gathering more resources, and returning with a new plan. What changed after Albulena was tone. The confidence became more cautious. Camps were laid out differently. Scouts were used more aggressively. Commanders learned to fear terrain that had once seemed like a mere inconvenience. In the Albanian mountains, that caution mattered. It meant the war continued, but it also meant the war became harder and more expensive for the empire. That was Skanderbeg's real strategic achievement. He turned conquest into a burden. There's a detail I keep coming back to when I think about this period. Albania could not win by occupying Ottoman cities or marching into the heart of the empire. It won, or at least endured, by forcing the Ottomans to fight on ground that punished them year after year, campaign after campaign. And Skanderbeg kept fighting. Not always with the clean drama of Albulena. Often it was smaller actions, skirmishes in passes, raids on supply lines, sudden sorties from fortresses. Sometimes there were sieges, long, grinding, ugly affairs where starvation and disease did as much damage as steel. If you picture a fortress like Kruja perched high on a hill, you can understand why it mattered. Stone walls don't just stop an army, they delay it, and delay can be a weapon when you're outnumbered. But delay comes at a cost. Supplies must be stored, families must endure raids, alliances must be maintained, and those alliances were never guaranteed. Venice had commercial interests, Naples had political calculations, the papacy had spiritual rhetoric and limited practical power. Their support could appear and vanish with their own crises. Skanderbeg had to negotiate constantly, while still leading men in the field. That kind of life ages a person quickly. By the time he died in January of 1468, he had spent more than 20 years living in that pressure. The sources often say malaria, which would be entirely plausible in that region and in that era. And if you've ever studied resistance movements, you know what usually happens next. Without the central figure, the balance shifts. The Albanian clans had unified because Skanderbeg made unity feel necessary and possible. When he was gone, old rivalries and old calculations didn't disappear. They returned because they never truly left. The League weakened, coordination became harder, and the Ottomans, patient and relentless, pressed again. By the late 1470s, the last major strongholds were giving way. Sieges grew heavier. Bombards and siege engineering improved. Fortresses that once seemed unbreakable were battered, starved, negotiated into surrender, or simply overwhelmed, and the human cost deepened. You can imagine the refugee lines on mountain paths, families carrying bundles, leading animals, leaving villages they may never see again. Inside besieged walls, soldiers and civilians sharing thin rations, counting days by candle stubs and the sound of stones striking stone. Occupation followed, garrison patrols, new banners in old streets, a slow reshaping of daily life under imperial administration. Still, symbols survive in places where armies do not. In homes, people hid tokens, a carved emblem, a piece of cloth, a story told quietly to children who were told to remember even when speaking openly was dangerous. In monasteries and archives, scribes wrote down names and dates, trying to preserve something that war kept trying to erase. And that is the long shadow of Albulena. A single battle did not decide Albania's ultimate fate, but it became a memory powerful enough to outlast defeat. It became proof that for one morning in the mountains, the empire that seemed unstoppable could be made to stumble. History isn't just the moment of impact, it's what a society carries afterward. And Skanderbeg's resistance, successful or not by the standards of conquest, left Albania with a legacy of endurance that no occupation could fully extinguish.